Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for the Cold War Spaces series. Today our guest is Alex Vitale on this topic of profiling space, policing during and after the Cold War. Alex Vitale is the professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics from 2008, and from 2018, The End of Policing. His academic writings on policing have appeared in Policing and Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology. He's also a frequent essayist whose writings have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice News, Fortune, and USA Today. He's also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. Today's program will be a 30-minute conversation with Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A, so please get your questions to put in the Q&A box during that time. Appreciate all questions, but ask that you please keep them short to no longer than a sentence or two. We also have the chat box open. Please keep in mind for questions and comments for the speakers. Please use the Q&A box since that's where they'll be looking. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. And it's always nice to see what city people are tuning in from. And we'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page if you'd like to go back and watch or share it or see the recordings of our other programming. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Joes will get us started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. In the ideological battle between capitalism and communism during the Cold War, the concept of freedom took center stage. Western democracies, it was claimed, valued freedom of speech, thought, conscience, religion, and expression. Whereas in the totalitarian countries of the Soviet bloc, these freedoms simply did not exist. However, history isn't always as black and white as we tend to think. Whereas under communism, very real political oppression was often challenged by political dissidents and an underground free-spirited cultural scene, freedom in the West was an aspiration that wasn't always fully realized, especially for people of color. Today, we'll look into the role of the police in American Cold War culture and beyond. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially since the police killings of, among others, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and most recently, Jonathan Price, public attention has been strongly focused on police violence and racial profiling, past and present. Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing, is at the very center of these debates. I will speak with him about surveillance, overreaching law enforcement, and the limitations of freedom during the Cold War and in our present day. Alex, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you, Joes.
So let's start generally. You wrote that the myth of policing in a liberal democracy is that the police exist to prevent political activity crossing the line into criminal activity such as property destruction and violence. Why is this a myth and who upholds it?
Yeah, so the general kind of liberal myth we have about police is that they're there to enforce the law, that they operate within a legal framework and that this guides what they do. But it's, I think, much more accurate to think about policing in terms of enforcing order. And that order is not an order that automatically benefits everyone equally. That's part of why we have this liberal myth that, well, they enforce the law is good for everyone, therefore policing is inherently beneficial. But if we look closely at the history of policing in the US and internationally, we see that when push comes to shove in a time of political crisis, that policing becomes a tool of maintaining a particular notion of order. And in that sense, it has at root a kind of political mission, whether it's putting down slave revolts, facilitating colonialist expansion, managing the behavior of working class trade unionists, et cetera. this means that police will frequently operate outside of this technical legal framework. They will illegally surveil people. They will disrupt meetings. They will develop partnerships with right-wing groups and feed them information or use them for intelligence gathering or for breaking up meetings, etc. So once we understand law enforcement as an order maintenance function, I think we get a lot more clarity about explaining, like, for instance, the excessive use of violence this summer by the police. That is clearly unlawful, but served a political purpose of maintaining police authority as a kind of unquestioned force in American society.
Yeah, do you think this is a specifically American phenomenon, or is it international? How do you see
Not
that?
at all, not at all. Oftentimes, let's say in Europe, the extent of this kind of heavy-handed political policing becomes less obvious in situations where there's a high degree of political legitimacy and a low level of sort of intensive resistance to order. But one need only look at, like, what goes on with German protest policing over the last generation or so, where there have been problems of right-wing infiltration of these paramilitary forces and their willingness to use very high levels of violence against certain groups that are perceived to be a greater threat to order, not necessarily the law, but to order, than other kinds of groups. And when we look at countries that have less legitimacy, more inequality, more resistance, we see things like mano dura policing in Latin America, more militarized policing, and even a blurring of police lines and military lines in places like parts of Africa, et cetera.
Right. So today we will focus mainly on the United States, and I would like to start with a few questions relating to the Cold War period. In the 1940s and 50s, in the time of Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee blacklisting people in the film, in the movie world, etc., you described the activities of Red Squads, monitoring people. Can you tell us a little bit what these Red Squads were all about and what their activities entailed?
Yeah, well, the history of this kind of political policing or high policing, of course, begins long before the Cold War. Many of these so-called Red Squads get formed in the wake of socialist movements of the teens and 20s. Sometimes in response to, the Soviet Revolution, there's a great deal of concern beginning really in World War I about the rise of these left movements and their potential to undermine, for instance, the American war effort during the First World War. So these Red Squads get created to begin the process of intelligence gathering. So keeping files on people, monitoring their speeches, media appearances, public events, and then a process of undermining their activities, sometimes subtly through misinformation campaigns, but also through intimidation and sometimes outright violence, falsified charges, arrests, etc. So these Red Squads go into abeyance somewhat in the 1940s, but by the 1950s, with the growth of strong anti-communist sentiment in that post-war period, we see the reinvigoration of these Red Squads, who again begin widespread intelligence gathering. Even though there aren't strong far-left movements in the United States, those few people who kind of lift their head up in favor of a more radical politics become targeted, and that targeting also works its way down to folks who maybe were active in the 1930s and 40s, part of Popular Front type organizations, but there's this endless appetite for political enemies, and local policing as well as federal policing plays a role in feeding that mill, often in conjunction with right-wing civil society organizations who help with the intelligence gathering and also when blacklists get created, it's sometimes these civil society groups that are the ones directly intimidating employers, intimidating coworkers, spreading rumors about people to make sure that they aren't able to get work or engage in political activity.
Right, so those were the consequences of those targeting activities to actually make it impossible for people to work or to be active.
That's right.
All right. So then in the 1960s and 70s, the period of the civil rights movement and the demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, among other things, you describe two, I would say, opposing tendencies in your book. One is the strategy of escalated force, the philosophy that you just have to use maximum violence to quell demonstrations. But the other is a tendency to more professionalization, de-escalation. Several reports were written about that, commissions advised on it, was supported by the American Civil Liberties Union. Can you tell us how those two opposing philosophies, if you will, worked out in practice?
Yeah, I think we need a little bit of a framework for thinking about this, which is that, policing craves legitimacy. Policing comes to replace military and militia interventions in producing social order, and those interventions tended to be more violent and indiscriminate, and as such often produced additional political problems of legitimacy for regimes that rely on them. What we see in the 1960s is the initial response to both civil rights protests and anti-war protests is very heavy-handed, similar to what we've seen this summer in the United States. But this begins to produce legitimacy problems. It undermines a broad public trust in police, and it begins to aid in this questioning of these fundamental institutional arrangements in the United States that are behind reproducing both racial inequality and a kind of militaristic foreign policy, et cetera. So policing in this period of crisis looks towards how it can produce more legitimacy. And the way it does this is to try to affect order maintenance in less overtly violent ways. And so this becomes called things like negotiated management. So the policing attempts to become more negotiation focused, a little bit more tolerant, picks its battles a little bit more carefully, allows a certain amount of disruptive protest as long as it stays within certain boundaries. And as the social movements of the 1960s and early 70s begin to unwind, are repressed, and the mood of the country becomes more conservative, social movements are demobilized, it becomes much easier to practice these reformed forms of protest policing. So throughout the 80s and 90s, we mostly see this less violent, less confrontational, more accommodating forms of protest policing. But now what we've seen since, let's say, the Occupy Wall Street period, Black Lives Matter period, the challenges to order have become more substantial, and the policing has become more violent and repressive in response.
Yeah, so really a direct reflection of what is going on in society as a whole. That's interesting. One of the very intriguing elements of your book is that you point to the influence of publications on thinking about policing. And as an example, I want to mention Edward Benfield's 1970 book, The Unheavenly City, and then James Wilson and George Kelling's article, Broken Windows, the Police and Neighborhood Safety. Can you explain how those publications influence the thinking about the role of the police?
So in the wake of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s and other social movements around women's rights, gay rights, lesbian rights, environmental movements, et cetera, there is a retrenchment of the right, who is concerned that these movements have acquired too much power, that it's destabilizing to conservative views of social order, And so a whole series of neoconservative intellectuals begin to articulate a new kind of vision of what order should look like and how it could be produced. And out of this comes the so-called broken windows theory, which says that the reason that cities have problems is because we're not sufficiently micromanaging the behavior of poor non-white people through intensive and invasive policing, that we've given them too much freedom, too much liberation, and this has turned into disorderly behavior that then leads to a climate of moral deregulation and permissiveness. And the way we reverse this is through stop and search operations, constant police harassment, putting a cop on every street corner, enforcing zero tolerance standards, et cetera. And this was always a political project that enlisted the police. And it fit with the kind of growth of disorder that was occurring in the 1980s and 90s, mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, increased black market activity around drugs and sex work. And those problems get turned into policing problems rather than problems of poverty, inequality, housing market failure, et cetera.
Right, and of course the concept of law and order is all over the place in our current political situation. We will come back to that. I wanted to ask you also about the training of police. So on the one hand, we know, and this is also true for our present day, that there are trainings that focus on alerting police officials to racial bias, advising them how to de-escalate situations, etc. But then you also give counter examples of companies such as Close Quarters Battle and Trojan Securities, who also train police officers, but with a very different take. What are they doing and what is their impact?
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have this growth of militarized police training that fits with the sort of political mission that's been given to police. You know, we tell the police they're waging a war on drugs and a war on terror and a war on gangs and a war on crime. And the training has come to reflect this. Now, the antidote to this that's been proposed is, well, we need to give them different training. De-escalation training, anti-bias training. We need to take out some of this militarized killology training that people have written about. The problem is that the underlying wars are still being waged. So that what we're finding is that these attempts to fix the problem with training are not working. So the officers who were present in Minneapolis for the killing of George Floyd had anti-bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras and all the rest. And it just didn't make any difference because the sort of structural functional mission of policing had remained unreformed. And that ultimately is a political problem that can't be fixed with a police training module.
Right. So, of course, since the publication of your book in 2017, a lot has happened. What would you say, generally speaking, has been the impact of the Department of Justice, first under Jeff Sessions and now under William Barr, but also generally speaking, the Trump administration on the approach of policing?
Well, let me just take one step back first and talk about the impact of the Obama administration.
Okay.
You know, the Obama administration tried to fix policing in the wake of the killing of Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and so many others, right? They said, well, we're going to fix this in two ways. We're going to initiate a lot of federal investigations of local police departments, and we're going to make them change their training and procedures and oversight mechanisms. And we're going to have this task force on 21st century policing that's going to lay out all these best practices for anti-bias training and, you know, de-escalation training and all the rest. So none of that worked. That did not help. And that's part of the reason why in the current moment, the demands from the streets, no one's holding up a sign saying more money for body cameras or more money for implicit bias training. They're calling for defunding the police. Now, the Trump administration was not interested in reforming police. So there was no pretense. They did not bring investigations. They did not bring criminal charges against police. They did not initiate any task forces. They just said, whatever you want to do is fine with us. They embraced policing as the solution to every problem under the sun. And that's the situation we're in now at the federal level. But the tension right now is between the demands on the streets calling for reducing the scope, power, and intensity of policing, and the leadership of the Democratic Party, who's still committed to the Obama-era reforms, and then the right wing, enabled by the Trump administration, that wants to give police more power and resources. And those are kind of the three camps that are competing for what we're going to see going forward.
Right. So there has been a lot of discussion, of course, nowadays in the wake of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations about the use of, not the use of violence, but the looting, arson, vandalism as happening at the outskirts of the demonstrations. And actually there are widely varying opinions about it, from accepting what is happening as a necessary byproduct to completely delegitimizing the demonstrations themselves because of the looting. What is your take on this discussion?
Well, so when we see this kind of political violence, that's a sign of a legitimacy crisis. Normal politics is not working. I think people on the ground who are experiencing abusive policing have no faith in the leadership of either of our political parties right now in doing anything about it. And they don't see any space in local politics in most of these cases. And so they're turning that frustration and rage, into violence, hoping that this will be heard, et cetera. I mean, I can't speak for those folks any more than I can tell them what to do, right? So all we can do is just see from the outside what's going on here. If we want to see significant advances made in this, obviously we can't rely on looting and property destruction and fighting with the police as the only strategy. And if we look at Minneapolis and many of these other cities where we've seen some pretty intense protests, that's not the only thing that's going on. There is concrete community organizing going on too. And I think the challenge for the movement going forward is how to balance that need for resistance in the street with the need for concrete political mobilization that gets expressed as really shifting resources from criminalization to community empowerment.
Right, and that actually brings me to the final question I want to ask you before we move to the Q&A, and that is your perspective on what needs to happen, first of all, within the police force, but then also in terms of the organization of our society. What do you envision as a structural solution to the problems you have been discussing in this interview?
Well, there are immediate steps we can take, and we see some cities beginning to do this. They're trying to get police out of the schools and bring back counselors. They're trying to get police out of the mental health business and create alternative response capacities. This is tremendously important. It could save a lot of lives, and it will help advance core issues of racial and economic justice, but that's not going to fix the kind of profound market failures that have gotten us into the mess that we're in, massive inequalities, mass homelessness, things like this. So ultimately, we also need long-range solutions to these problems that are about addressing the long legacies of racialized inequality, creating more robust universal benefits, perhaps, looking at better government intervention into housing and labor markets, healthcare markets, to make sure that people's basic quality of life can be maintained and not be determined by, racial characteristics.
Right, so solutions that only focus on the police itself will always remain superficial. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think they're part of a process of mobilization, and also we need them to quit killing people, and also they will be used against our movements in many cases. So policing is important, but and I think, when we look back on the protests of the 1960s in the United States, while most of them were triggered about policing and many of them focused on the police, no one today understands what was happening to them as just a policing reform or police, get rid of police movement. This was about a broad movement for racial justice. And I think that that's how we need to understand this current moment as well.
Great, thank you very much. And with that, we go to the Q&A. I would like to ask everyone to put questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, because that's where I'm going to look. And we start with a question by Bruce Hollihan. Do you think that the USA reliance on local police departments can be problematic, as opposed to a national police as seen in many of the developed countries who are allies of the USA? And do you see a possibility for change in US policing with regard to this question?
Well, yeah, so in the United States, we have 19,000 independent local police departments. So it is very different, even than in England, which has these kinds of regional agglomerations that are all technically under the Home Office. So it's definitely different. I don't really see a political scenario where we create a national police force. And I think if we look at what's going on in Washington right now, that doesn't sound very appealing to me. And the reality of the moment right now is that I think we can win a lot of victories at the local level that hopefully over time will sort of percolate up. So is it crazy that we have, all these departments, about half of whom have fewer than 25 officers? Yes, it's kind of crazy. It's inefficient. It leads to a lot of really parochial policing. So we should be looking at consolidation, especially in rural areas, creating county-wide forces, things like that. But I don't think, that creating a national police force is going to get us out of this mess.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Jason Underhill. He writes, Mr. Vitale, do you really believe there is a more violent protest policing now, or do you think it's just because there is more recording of police behavior? Because I personally have participated in protests for decades, and the policing doesn't seem any more violent now than it did 20 years ago. The 2000 DNC protests had an incredibly violent police response. At the October 2000 anti-police protest in Los Angeles, non-violent protesters were trampled by police horses and shot at close range with less lethal weapons. People had to be hospitalized with very severe injuries. Why do you think that protest policing is more violent now?
Okay, I don't think that's quite exactly what I said. What I said was that in this earlier period, when police make discretionary decisions and they begin to try to handle as many protests as possible through this softer touch, but they always reserve that right to treat certain protests in this more aggressive and repressive fashion. While the big convention protests were often a site of aggressive and violent policing, what we also saw at a lot of these, and I attended a number of these around the country going back to the 1980s, is that what usually happens is there are multiple protests during these things. And what you see is some protests are given permits and allowed to march and are treated with a soft touch, and others are violently repressed, which just goes to show the police are capable of choosing a less intensive, repressive strategy. They just choose not to because they perceive certain groups as institutionally threatening. What's happening now is that a huge body of protests now is all being perceived as institutionally threatening. So we see a lot less of the soft touch policing and a lot more of the aggressive policing. But yes, in American history, we've seen people shot down in the streets by police at protests. Fortunately, we're not seeing anything like that right now.
Right, thank you very much. Sharam Asmudeh asks, what are some of the metrics which trace the militarization of the police with the inception of the war on terror?
Okay, so the war on terror initiates not just militarized policing, but also this expansion of intelligence-led policing, joint terrorism task forces, fusion centers, and this sort of thing. And it also expands the police's rights under law to engage in more surveillance. So the letters of interest and things like that give them the ability to go to employers, businesses, telecommunications companies, and collect an ever-growing body of information. So I think that 9/11 was crucial in establishing this idea that terrorism is a policing and military problem, not a political or foreign affairs problem, and that the solution is to expand those policing powers, and that this has led to both the production of more military hardware for local policing, but also the idea that police are the appropriate tool to manage what are ultimately political problems.
Thank you. Sheridan Smith asks, do you think that the systemic issue we see in domestic local policing are evident outside the United States? And is there a larger global conversation we should have about policing? So I think you already answered the first part, but the second is actually quite interesting. Do you think we need a global conversation about this?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, I did an interview with some Latin American journalists today. I'm doing an event in the Netherlands in the morning. I'm doing something in France, so there is a growing international conversation about this. The contours of policing are not that radically different. There are important differences, but they're not radically different. And, I lecture regularly in the UK and have an appointment there. So I think there is a growing interest in trying to sort of connect these things. And for me, this has always been the case. I have worked extensively outside the United States. I've lived in East Asia. I've consulted with human rights groups and police departments internationally. So at the very least, a global perspective on these issues should inform whatever local organizing we're doing, as well as research, policy making, et cetera.
Thank you. Next question is, what about the role of agents provocateurs in the violence near Black Lives Matter protests, such as Umbrella Man, the right-wing activist who first broke AutoZone windows in Minneapolis?
So agents provocateurs are always problematic, right? We know that they have existed historically, and we find isolated cases, but in the heat of the moment, it's often extremely difficult to determine whether or not someone is acting, at the behest of security forces, or is someone who just has their own idea about how the protest should go, or is just acting on their own independent misjudgment or mental health problems or whatever. Generally, I think one of the ways to think about this is that we need to take people in protest movements need to take a bit more responsibility for managing the tenor of these demonstrations. That doesn't mean that I'm sitting here wagging my finger at people saying, that property destruction is automatically illegitimate and undermines the movement, but people need to be able to make decisions about what is appropriate in that moment and what reflects the kind of broader will of the participants in that particular moment, and then some ability to enforce that. And that, I think, has really been lacking. And that, of course, creates a fertile ground in which agents provocateur can operate.
Right. Susanna Altman writes, you talked about the current legitimacy crisis leading to violence, escalation as a political symptom on both sides. How would you explain the case, arrest, trial of Angela Davis in the early 1970s? Did the international response lead to measurable changes in policing, or rather contrary, as still deep in Cold War trenches?
Well, I think the Cold War is a factor for that case and for the civil rights movement protests more broadly, right? The United States was engaged in this global competition with the Soviet bloc and emergent, communist-oriented anti-colonial movements in places like Vietnam, for instance. And so we're trying to compete for hearts and minds across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. And so the civil rights movement understood this and tried to mobilize that to bring pressure on American administrations from Kennedy moving forward. Well, even Eisenhower to some extent. So it's not surprising that international pressure matters in a period when we're in such direct competition. Today, the situation's a little bit different, right? American hegemony, the lack of some kind of direct competitor, I think mutes the value of, for instance, statements from international human rights groups about domestic abuses in the United States. And certainly, we're not going to get relief from, the Chinese, whose domestic human rights abuses are dramatically worse than our own.
Thanks. Yeah. Charles Chu writes, returning to the Cold War versus post-Cold War framing of this talk, do you think the red baiting of this summer's uprising by the right has concretely changed the character of political police repression directed against it? For instance, the elevation of Antifa, white anarchists and outside agitators as bogeymen, and the identification of Black Lives Matter as a Marxist movement?
I think the underlying dynamics are the same. It's just that the labels are different. They tried at one point during the earlier round of protests 4 or 5 years ago to label people socialists, thinking and supporters of Bernie Sanders and Democratic Social. Oh my God, these people are socialists. Well, it turned out socialists are quite popular right now, that many young people identify positively with the idea of socialism. And so that attempt to demonize them through that labeling was not effective. And so now they've stumbled on this Antifa thing and they're trying to use that. I don't think it's been very successful either, frankly, but the Trump administration is desperate to embrace a criminalization of dissent strategy. And so they will continue to search for labels and framings of the political movements that will facilitate that criminalization. Antifa doesn't quite seem to be working. So if Trump is still around in a few months, be prepared to see some new attempts.
Thanks. John Gary asks if you can describe non-militarized policing. How would that look like?
Right. Well, there's some really good research out there that says, well, does it really make sense to draw this bright line between civilian policing and military policing? And I tend to be very sympathetic to this. It's like we can see some differences, but ultimately the history of policing is a history of interchange with the military. And it's a two-directional interchange. My friend Stuart Schrader's excellent book, Badges Without Borders, discusses this history, for instance, during the Vietnam era, where police leaders are being sent to Vietnam to advise military leaders about counterinsurgency strategies and how to create more legitimacy for South Vietnamese security forces. How can we train South Vietnamese police to be more legitimate as part of their effort to suppress the Viet Cong in the South? And then people learn a bunch of lessons in Vietnam and take that back to domestic policing in the United States. So we don't want to overstate this bright line or this possibility that we could create truly civilian policing that's not influenced by the military in any way, and that this would somehow be inherently superior.
Thank you. The next question is, given the trajectory we seem to be on, do you see an expansion of private police forces, or do you see a more explicit capture of the public police forces by local elites?
So, I mean, we have a massive private policing infrastructure already. And I think there will always be a dynamic tension there. And certainly fear of disorder will drive an expansion of both public policing and private policing. Now, there's a bit of a red herring right now that says, well, the defund the police movement is going to get rid of police, and so everyone will just have private police. But this is a misunderstanding of the defund the police movement and what they're talking about. What they're demanding is that we begin the process of shifting resources from police-centered strategies to community-centered strategies for making people safer than they actually are today. So policing is not super effective at producing safety. It comes with a huge amount of negative collateral consequences. And maybe if we actually created a mental health infrastructure, funded the schools properly, created community-based anti-violence programs to deal with domestic violence and gang, the communities would actually be safer than they are today. And so there would not be a need for enhanced private policing.
Right. Next question is by Disa Lindgren. She asks, the local police union in Culver City has been heavily engaged in campaigning on social media with print mailers and now with a billboard against certain candidates and for others. The police union has been issuing statements attacking local activists and candidates by name and with photos that have been critical of the local police and the 37% of our city budget on the police department. It seems like a David versus Goliath situation. What strategies do you think are most effective in countering police union rhetoric?
Well, I think we need to, first of all, just expose it. I mean, some of it is so patently abusive and racist that just more public awareness of what they're saying will undermine their cause in this particular moment. But also, there are a lot of ways in which these unions have gotten a pass from elected officials. They're treated as if they were just any other kind of municipal local union. So a politician will be like, well, I'm pro-union. I take money from the teachers union, the police union, the sanitation union. And I think what this movement needs to do is it needs to draw a bright line in the sand that says that police unions are something different. They don't just come around asking for another 2% on their pension and some better health benefits. They're actually producing a really rancid racist politics of mass criminalization. When the teachers come, they want more money for chalk. And when the police come around, they want a new law, criminalizing gangbangers. They want to make the war on drugs more intensive, and they want to eliminate any oversight of how they wage these wars. So what's been happening actually all summer has been local movements going after politicians who've taken police union money and endorsements and getting them to reject it. And I think people just have to say, any politician who takes that money and those endorsements cannot be our friend anymore. That this is a bright line issue, that we're canceling them if they take that money.
Right. There's time for two final questions. The first by Eric Pessel. Going back to your statement that the police reforms instituted under Obama were ineffective because they weren't backed politically, but they were by the Obama administration. Could you clarify?
Well, they weren't backed locally, right? And it's bigger than just that the reforms weren't backed. It's that the mission of policing remained unreformed. And this is really the issue here, is that these reforms, even with political backing, are not going to work. They haven't worked. They're not going to work because they misunderstand the nature of the problem. They think that if we just gave narcotics units anti-bias training, that this would fix the racism that's built into the war on drugs. And this, of course, is ludicrous, right? The solution is to get the police out of the drug business. to end the war on drugs, to look at harm reduction, legalization, targeted economic development programs, et cetera, not more training and resources for police.
Right. Then the last question by Sharon Asmodee. Would it be more sensible to reframe defunding the police as reallocating resources in order to generate greater support?
Put that in a hashtag. That's the problem, right? Is that I never used this language before this summer. This wasn't what people were talking about on the ground. That was something that could be put on a cardboard protest sign. It was like a quick distillation of one part of what this is about. So I have no love for defund the police as a moniker for this movement. I'm happy to hear other suggestions, but it's got to fit on one line of Twitter code on your mobile phone. Otherwise, people won't use it. And I can just say I've been in conversations with some very bright people in the movement, and we're struggling. So feel free to give it a try.
Okay, this is a call for all viewers today to come up with a good solution. Alex Vitale, I want to thank you very much for your incredibly insightful ideas and this very topical topic, which I'm sure our viewers have followed with a lot of interest. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. I don't often get asked to talk about the political policing chapter in the book. And so I was really happy to have the opportunity to talk about red squads and the Palmer raids and political policing more broadly.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I have, as always, to apologize for questions not answered because of the time, evidently. Next week, Wednesday again, we have our third virtual Art Past Present interview co-hosted by Vera Karapetian, and our guest is video artist Ira Edwardovna. And then in 2 weeks from now, October 21st, also Wednesday, we resume Cold War Spaces with Arch Getty, distinguished research professor of history at UCLA, on ballot space, Soviet elections in perspective. And of course, we will also address elections under Putin and our upcoming one in November. So hope to see you next week and in 2 weeks from now. Bye-bye.